Everybody, and welcome to webinar 51. Now you are qualified. So while you're all coming in and filling the virtual room, what I'd like to know in the chat is, if you're a social worker, what kind of social work are you doing? Or if you're a student and you're maybe partway through your studies, what kind of social work would you like to do? If you are qualified and you know what area you're going into, that's fantastic. Pop it into the chat and tell us what's going on for you at the moment. So we're on webinar 51. Now you're qualified, and we're just looking at what kind of social work you're doing or you hope to do. And let's have a look at the variety of answers that we get in the chat, because today's all about now you are qualified. So we've had our fantastic graduation last week. Hopefully you all enjoyed that and you are gearing up for your first social work job. So we've got lots and lots of information tonight. We've got lots of the team sharing their own stories, and we're just looking at what area of social work you're hoping to go into. Yeah, so the members seem to have, participants seem to have slowed down now, Siobhan, so let's go.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly. I think when you asked that question about international guests and what are you doing, I think it is really important for all of us to remember that social work is more than statutory. And I think sometimes, particularly in Great Britain, maybe even the whole of the UK, then we are very focused on social work being in a statutory field, but actually internationally that's not the case. And we're going to conclude tonight with a quick slide where I'm going to tell you about the International Federation of Social Workers project about newly qualified social workers. So that'll kind of end us on an international note as well. So as Kelly said, welcome to our 51st Wednesday night webinar. We've got one more left this season, then we're going to take a break for the summer. But following on from last week's graduation, which was really great, and we really enjoyed hosting that for you, then we thought, okay, let's take a look at taking those first steps and making that transition, if you like, from student to social worker. 4 members of the Social Work Student Connect team are now newly qualified. In fact, Kat and Chris have almost completed their first year, and we have started to say, can we still call the team the Student Connect team, because they won't be students, they won't be newly qualified workers, but they still want to stay on the team. So but they're nearly all the way through. So 4 members of the team are going to share their experiences and their tips, if you like, tonight. But what we're going to try to do is come up with 12 top tips for your first 12 months. I see in the chat, and from what Kelly was saying, lots of people are talking about this as the ASYE year. In itself, that's an acronym. So when you were talking about jargon, in itself, it's jargon. For those of you who don't know, that stands for the Assessed and Supported Year in Employment, but that only applies to England. In Wales, there's something different. In Northern Ireland have an AYE year, an assessed year in employment. Wales have a first year in employment and then move on to consolidation. Scotland are just looking at what they're going to do. So each country of the UK has something different, and internationally everywhere has something different. So we're going to try to make sure this isn't specific about a particular country, but we're going to try to come up with 12 top tips for your first 12 months in practice. My tips are going to focus on the journey, and my tips come from facilitating sessions for newly qualified social workers. I mean, I'm not newly qualified. I've been 31 years since I qualified, so a long time. So my tips come more from, if you like, talking to newly qualified social workers, but they'll be based around the journey analogy. Each of the 4 team members who are qualified and have already made that transition, they're going to share their top tip. And I think they all wanted more, and I limited them to 1, so that was a bit of an issue. But we're also hoping that you will share your top tips in the chat. So if you are qualified, or if you've been, if you've been 31 years qualified like me, you've still got something to offer people in the chat. So tell us in the chat, what are your top tips for one another? And then I know Kulturma and Di, when they send out the follow-up email, will probably try and gather some of those tips together for people, but put your top tips into the chat. So my first thought is, look, everybody has a completely different starting point, and that's always the case for newly qualified social workers. Some people go to the course straight from school like I did. Some people go to social work training after having many years of experience in an allied role. You know, everybody has a very different experience before they go on the course, and then a very different experience during the course. You know, where were your placements and so on. But with the impact of COVID, the starting points are going to be even more different this year. I think that's the thing. There will be even more varied this year. So my top tip, number one, is that you need to think of this transition that you're making as a continuing journey. And the landscape that you are traveling with this journey is going to be complex, and it's probably going to get more and more complex over time. So what I think is really important is that you know your starting point and you communicate it honestly and effectively to other people. And then learning agreements are helpful. So if you are in a country where they do something like the ASYE year, or if you're in Northern Ireland, you're doing AYE year, or you're doing your first year in Wales, it's likely that you will sit with your team manager, possibly an assessor, maybe a mentor. Lots of different people will have different experiences of who's going to travel with them along that journey. But you'll probably sit with somebody and do some sort of learning agreement that says, look, here's the experience I've got, here's what I'm doing, here's what I still need to do. Now, I know the temptation is, you've probably just done your job interview. In your job interview, you're having to tell them, I'm brilliant, look, I can do all of these marvelous things. And then you start and you feel like you've got to say, I can do all of these marvelous things. You need to be honest about your starting point. Okay, you've already got the job, you've already started. So just be honest now about, this is the experience that I haven't had. This is what I don't know. These are my learning needs. It's really, really important that you can communicate your journey and conceptualize it. Think about it as, here's where I am now. Here's where I want to be in 12 months' time. How do I get to that point? And everybody's journey is going to be different. You're all going to get to the same end point, if you like, but your journey is going to be different because each of you have got a different starting point. Each of you face different barriers along the way, and there might be some diversions that you've got to travel and all of that. But your end point, you're all going to get to, but you do need to be honest and communicate your starting point really clearly. Now, the picture that's up on the slide at the moment, that is to remind me of a newly qualified worker that I worked with actually many years ago now. She wrote her portfolio based around the journey. So she did a portfolio. She was an England-based ASYE portfolio, and she wrote a really brilliant reflective account about the journey and her starting point. And this is how she explained it. She said, I want you to imagine that being a social worker is kind of like being in Spain. And I've been, I think she was called a community care worker. So she was like an unqualified worker in the team. I've been a community care worker for many years. So people think I've been here for years. I'm in the same team that I was on when I started my training. She did an employment-based route. So she said, on the face of it, not much has changed. I'm still in the same team I was in before. And everybody thinks I've been here for years. And they'll say things like, oh, we don't see you as though you're newly qualified. And it's like they treat me as though I've been qualified for years. But I've not been in Spain. I've only just arrived in Spain. I might have left England a long time ago, but I've been in France. And actually, there's a lot of difference in the climate, the culture, the language, the food. Everything's different between France and Spain. I'm newly arrived. And this is what's really important for you to be conscious of. It might feel lovely as a newly qualified worker for your team to say to you, oh, but we don't see you as if you were newly qualified. It might feel really lovely inside, but actually, it's really important for you to make sure you say, but I am newly qualified. Because you are newly qualified, you need the support, you need to not be overloaded. And as soon as people say to you, but we don't see you as though you're newly qualified, it's when more work's going to get piled and less support and less. So be very clear, I am newly qualified. Be really clear about that and your starting point. Now, it might feel like this is a journey that's been going on forever. No, my training was a 4-year course, then I come out and it's your first year in practice. It might feel like this is a never-ending journey. When you're on placement, you start counting down, don't you? I've done 50 days, I've got this many to do, or I've done so many hours, I've got so many to do, whatever it is in your country. It's almost like a countdown when you're on placement or internship. Once you qualify, it's different. There's no countdown anymore. This is the journey. You're on it. And sometimes it can feel like it's never going to end. And sometimes it feels a bit scary. And I'm sure that COVID has probably exaggerated that as well. But you need to be clear that your journey isn't always going to go as you planned it. And you will experience a dip. Okay, now I've talked about this dip for many years. I personally, from my own experiences, I call it the 6-month dip. Some people have a premature dip, they have the dip at 3 months. Some people have a double dip, some people have a late dip, some people feel like they've never come out of the dip, but everybody is going to take a dip in the early part of your career, because it's almost like you've graduated, you're on a high, I've got the job, I'm on a high. Then you're in it and things start happening, and it can feel like, hang on a minute, this is a forever thing. I'm not counting down 70 days or 100 days now. This is a forever thing. And you will take a dip, potentially a dip in confidence, lots of different elements, lots of different feelings will surround you, but there will be a dip. Don't be frightened of the dip. Talk about the dip, share the dip. Everyone has had that dip. Don't sit in it thinking, I'm the only person who's ever been in this dip. You need to talk to other people about the dip. Now, you might recognize that image. If you're one of our regular attenders, okay, you might recognize that image because Kelly, Chris and Kat, when they did the webinar that they led on imposter syndrome, which a lot of that looked at being newly qualified and the experience of being newly qualified. So if you didn't watch it, watch that back on YouTube. But they took this image and they added to it, didn't you? You put like little butterflies on, you put little flowers on, then you put a tiger hanging around in the corner because this tiger might jump out at you at any point. And that is what the journey feels like. The journey can feel really quite scary, but the dip is nothing to be scared of. The dip is an ordinary experience that's probably going to be exaggerated or created a double dip or created a deeper dip because of COVID. But this is an ordinary experience. So if you're in your dip, don't worry, you'll come out the other side of it. So in terms of Kat and Chris doing the imposter syndrome and Kelly, who's not yet qualified but did the imposter syndrome as a student perspective, but Chris and Kat are the two team members who've been qualified the longest, so 9 months into first year. So Chris is going to give us her top tip. Now, I know you wanted to share lots of top tips, Chris.
Yeah, I had a whole slide full.
You did, and I said, no, you can only have one. So this is your top tip time then.
Indeed. Would you mind just pushing on to the next slide? Thank you. So for me, I think the biggest thing this year has been about reflection. And reflection is something we learn to do all the way through our course. But for me, this year, it's really cemented, I guess, is the right way of saying it. And, you know, it's different kinds of reflection. It's that not just the reflection on the work that we do, but that self-reflection that I'm finding is the most important thing this year. You know, that bit about me, what am I doing? You know, can I be different? And actually, my sort of tip really is, you know, keep yourself a file, keep your written work from your studies. And as you go through your post-qualifying year, look back at it and use it as a reminder, because you will be able to see how you've developed and how far you've come. You'll be able to see how your writing skills have developed, and you'll be able to really learn from that. And I've done that. I've actually kind of gone back through looking at it as part of my sort of study time during my ASYE, and I've found it quite interesting to see how my writing has changed and how my reflective skills have changed through that time. I'm also thinking about the reflection. I did some training on Monday, which was only an hour, which had some people from Social Work England on it, talking about recording their CPD and what their expectations is, and actually what they're looking for is reflection and impact on practice. So again, it just reinforced for me that whole that whole theme really of making, you know, reflecting on your journey and things. And I've actually used, as part of my portfolio for my post-qualifying year, which I cannot say, we have to write a load of reflective logs, and I've actually used those and put them straight into the Social Work England site for my CPD, because I've just thought, actually, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. They don't want to see a load of certificates. They know I'm doing training because my employer gives me that. So I'm hoping that that's going to, you know, sort of stand me in good stead, really. And continue to work on your reflective skills. And actually, we did a webinar right near the beginning, didn't we, about reflective writing and about how to spot the descriptive bits and the reflective bits. And I took so much from that. If we can get the link in the chat, it'd be great. Otherwise, I'll look for it in a minute. But that, I would say, just continue to work on your reflective skills, because even after you've qualified, you know, mine have developed more this year than they've done throughout the whole of my studies. So, you know, and I just, as a final point, I would really relate to that example you gave at the beginning, Siobhan, of the, you know, we don't see you as a newly qualified worker. That you could have written that about me, because I've been in my team a long time, and actually they don't often see me in that way, and I have to keep reminding my manager that there's stuff I haven't done. I haven't come across this yet, I haven't done that yet, you need to give me space to do it, because he's been managing me for 9 years, and I think he just sometimes forgets that there's things I haven't come across and haven't done. So make sure you do that, you know, make sure you take that moment and just say, I need headspace to think about this and reflect on it. And that's me.
And that's brilliant advice. Thank you, Chris. And do you know what I'd say about that as well is, as I was listening to you talking about it, you might have seen me giggle a little bit. I was just thinking, this isn't just advice for the first year, because I actually go back sometimes to my final placement on my social work training more than 31 years ago. The paper is really fragile now, but there's some paper that, and it obviously it doesn't exist electronically because everything was typed on an old-fashioned typewriter in those days, I mean literally, but I had to type something out about my learning in relation to each piece of work that I did on my final placement. It was only little, and it's just a couple of sentences, and I go back to that sometimes to remind myself where I was 31 years ago. I find it really helpful as a practice educator to look back at where was I, to know where do I expect students to be and newly qualified workers to be. So actually that's a really good hint about keep your written work from your studies, you know, because 31 years I'm still looking at that written work from my studies. So that's a really good top tip. I think sometimes people feel like I just want to get rid of all of that, but keep it.
Yeah, it's been such a journey. They go, oh, I don't want to look at it anymore, but actually it's like looking at baby photos in a way to me. You know, that's what it's like.
Yeah, so that's brilliant advice. Thanks for that, Chris. Now, what I tried to do with putting my tips together and the tips from you as a team was also build on those. So I've also just built on the idea of reflection.
You're muted.
I don't know what happened then. I was trying to press a button and I somehow muted myself. Who knows what went on there. I tried to put together some ideas on reflection specifically for your first year in practice, because just in terms of the journey analogy, sometimes it feels like you're on a high-speed train and it's going that quickly. You know, when those trains go so quick, you can't even look outside because it makes you feel sick. There's no opportunity to look at the views and take the views around you in. So a couple of tips in terms of what I think is useful for reflection. The first one is to use this, which is from the University of York, the quick method for reflection of just 4 words: surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning. Now they're there in road signs because they really help you to navigate the journey. What I would advise you to do is at the start, literally try to do that weekly. It's only going to take you 5 minutes. It's a quick thing, but just write a few notes at the end of each week. What surprised me this week? What was I satisfied with this week? What was I dissatisfied with? What's been my key learning? Just pop those 4 things down each week, because what that will give you is it will really help you to provide evidence of your growth and your progress in supervision conversations, or if you have to do a portfolio like Chris was talking about. This really helps to pinpoint your learning, because when you first start in a team, loads of stuff surprises you. A few weeks later, you're not surprised by it anymore. And a few months in, you're part of that team now and you've forgotten what surprised you in the first place. So this just helps you to pinpoint that growth and progress. It's a very quick, very easy method, but really useful for reflection. And then the other one is one that you know that I mention all the time because I love it. But this is the one to help you to reflect over a period of time. So maybe if you are doing something like the ASYE that we're not really talking specifically about, but maybe if you were doing something like that, you'll have a review after 3 months and then after 6 months. And in preparation for the review, pull together, think about the journey so far. What's the journey been like so far? What's the weather been like along the journey? And think for yourself, what's been the sunshine moment of your first 3 months? What's been the rainy moment? What does that mean? Has there been any lightning? You know, maybe have there been any storms? How did you navigate the storms? Can you identify the fog? Has the fog lifted yet? Have you experienced any ice? You know, maybe did you slip up and or maybe did you feel a bit frozen out? Or it can mean different things to different people. What about the snow? I mean, literally go for every type of weather, but that's a really good model for reflecting over a period of time. Now, I talk about that one all the time, so I wanted to show you something new. And this is a model that you won't see anywhere else. It's one of my favourite pieces of group work, developed by a group of newly qualified social workers in the UK, looking at developing their own model of reflection. And this is what they developed, the Disney path of reflection. Now, I'm not a Disney expert, so don't ask me, I don't know. They're probably not all Disney. I'm not big into Disney. I did approach Disney and say, could we use this? Because it's like a model that a lot of people like, and Disney, no, they like to keep their copyright. So literally you'll never see it anywhere else but here tonight. It's the only place you're going to see it. That's the original flip chart that was developed by a group working together. And what they did was they talked about the first year in practice as being like a yellow brick road. They said it's a bit like, you know, in the Wizard of Oz, you told you're going to see the Wizard of Oz. Then when you get there, well, you can't see the Wizard of Oz yet. They said it's a bit like that in social work. You're told you're going to qualify, then you can see the Wizard of Oz. Oh, now you've got to do a first year portfolio. Then you can see the Wizard of Oz. Oh, no, now you've got to do your CPD. Then you can see the Wizard of Oz. It's like this never ending journey of the yellow brick road. And along the yellow brick road are the different characters that represent what you need to reflect on, particularly in the early part of your career. So, mirror, mirror on the wall, how do I look to the service user? I think that's from, is it Snow White, that one? Is it Snow White? I'm looking to Kelly's nodding. Okay, it's Snow White. Mary Poppins, in every job to be done, there should be an element of fun. So what are my values? What's the fun I'm finding in my work? Rafiki, I think he's called, the monkey in the Lion King. Apparently he has a famous quotation, apparently, the past can hurt you. You can either run from it or learn from it. So this is all about, where does my practice wisdom come from? What am I bringing from my past into my present as a social worker? Then the fairy godmother from Cinderella represents emotional intelligence, you know, because she asks, how do you feel, my dear? But also represents kind of miracle thinking. What might you be able to change about things, you know, because she changes a pumpkin into a carriage or whatever. Then you've got Princess Fiona from Shrek, who apparently represents to this group, represented, do I know what I'm doing and what I'm letting myself in for? And am I committing to this? And then finally, Dory, the fish from Finding Nemo, constantly asking questions. Why? What if? Next time? When? Where? I think that's a really lovely model of reflection for your first year in practice. So whichever one you want to use, as Chris said, top tip, think about reflection. Then we've got one of our very newly qualified team members, Nicola, who's just 3 months into her first role. So Nicola, if you're ready, if you want to put your mic on and give your top tip. Nicola, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
My top tip is to turn mute on during meetings and Zoom. I think my top tip for me is feeds into my need to see the whole picture. So for me, it's about connectivity and practice. And when I say that, I really think I needed to see the whole picture. And so although we go into social work thinking we want to know everything, actually, when you join a team, you kind of realize quite quickly that those teams may have a specific focus. And so I think it's important that you kind of identify and understand what your team's focus is. And because we're in this sort of COVID period where you really don't see people as much, and you may have loads of questions, I started looking at policies. I mean, when I first started, it was read the policies, and I read them, and really, I don't remember what I read, in all honesty. However, when I was able to identify, so say I was doing a CHIN plan, and I looked at the policy around CHIN plans, which is a child in need plan, and the meetings and what I needed to do, it helped me to create almost a checklist of things I needed to do, because I couldn't get the answers really quickly that I needed, but I knew that I needed to do it. So it's really helpful. Sorry, Dave, I'm reading your question. So it was really helpful to me to kind of use those policies to embed my understanding, and then sort of start to trim off the fat, because I knew what the focus needed to be. Particularly with loan working, I think it really helped. And I think don't waste time. That helped me to not waste time to reinvent the wheel. I think it was really important that with the time that I had and the allocations that were coming in, that I needed to specify what did I need to do. And I couldn't always find people to ask them what I needed to do, but I also knew the way that I needed to work. So within not reinventing the wheel, I had to align myself with my way of work with how what the service needed me to do. So it's kind of like ultimately that whole holistic picture of how I work, what is required, and then that all coming together so that my families get the best out of me. And actually it's made it a lot easier. And 3 months feels like 6, but it has made it a lot easier.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Nicola. And you just really made me giggle when you said I read the policies, and quite frankly, I cannot remember what I read, because that is the case, isn't it?
Not in the first 2 weeks, when all they're saying is read, and you really want to get on with it, and with all the best intentions you're reading, but there's no connection. But once you're doing the work, and suddenly you have a meeting to set up, or suddenly you need they start talking with an acronym. And it might be a joint housing assessment, and they're saying JHA, and you're thinking, what is that? Quickly go into the policy, and so after kind of helps you to create a checklist of what you need to do, and if it is actually what you need to do.
Absolutely. And Nicola, we know how much you love your checklist, so I can imagine you developing your own little checklist. And so, I mean, I can imagine.
If only I could turn the camera, you'd see my wall with all my checklists. I'm looking up at them now. They're a beauty.
I can imagine seeing them. So thank you very much for that, Nicola. Now, when the team members sent in their we just put in our WhatsApp group what the advice was going to be, and Nicola put this in and put learn those policies and procedures so you don't waste your time reinventing the wheel. But then I was thinking, but sometimes I think the wheel needs reinventing, but when you're new, you can't reinvent the wheel at the start, can you, Nicola? So I totally get that. But I like this quote, which is, the slides are not moving very well tonight. There we go. I love this quote. Don't reinvent the wheel, just realign it. And I think that's really important for all of you newly qualified workers. You're bringing such a lot into the teams that you're coming into. Fresh ideas, new ways of looking at things. So absolutely, Nicola, don't reinvent the wheel, but also realign it with all of your fabulous ideas, because you are an ideas person. So bring those ideas in as well. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, then let's carry on the journey. Tip 3 for me is prepare for supervision. Make the most of the supervision that you get. That's really important. I want you to imagine that supervision is kind of like the passport to your journey. You can't go on much of a journey without a passport. Well, we all know that. We're all having to staycation at the moment. No one can travel anywhere with your passport. But, you know, we used to be able to go further and do more things and experience new things when we could travel with a passport. And it's like that. You can't go very far in social work without good quality supervision. So I want you now to imagine, if I were to say to you, just think about your passport photo, kind of conjure it up in your mind's eye. What does your passport photo look like? To me, my passport photo looks nothing like me. It's me on a terribly bad day in 10 years' time. You know, it's not like I think I look like. That's the key thing, really, about understanding how you look to other people. I thought, oh, I'll put up a little funny image of a silly passport photo. I'll go on Google Images and put bad passport photo, and I'll put it on my slides. But that's not what you get. What you get if you Google image bad passport photo is advice on how to take the right kind of passport photo. And this is the image that jumped out at me. I've even had to write on it where it comes from because it's not where you would expect. This is passport advice from the Algerian embassy. It says you must not have your mouth covered by your hands, you must not have your eyes closed, and you must not have an unnatural facial expression or crying. And I looked at that and I thought, that's like a day in social work, really, isn't it? All of those emotions that we go through. Or maybe it's like an emotional demonstration of your first year as a social worker. What I'm really trying to bring out here is think about how you look to other people. So do think about your passport photo, but recognize that supervision should provide you with the space that you need to talk about your practice and how you're feeling. We really need to think about your emotions in the early part of your career, particularly. So use all of the supervision opportunities available to you. Get your passport stamped in as many ways as possible. In the olden days, wherever you used to travel to, you got your passport stamped. Think about it like that. Think about, can you get a stamp of group supervision? Can you get a stamp of informal supervision from somebody? Or what kind of supervision is on offer to you? So some teams have group supervision. Some employers offer peer supervision with other new social workers. You know, some areas offer intervision, not very much in the UK, but very much in Scandinavian countries, the rest of Europe. Intervision is very significant. Many employers offer separate reflective supervision for people, whether that's as an individual or as a group. So as a minimum, you should be getting formal one-to-one supervision with your line manager. The rules in England are that in your first 6 weeks, you should receive weekly supervision, that then you should receive fortnightly supervision up to the point you've been 6 months qualified, and then a minimum of monthly supervision. Now that's England and it will differ everywhere, but make sure you use the supervision that is available to you. And then we're going to go to Kat's top tip, 9 months through your first role. Kat, if you want to take the mute off, we're not doing well with the mute button tonight, but if you want to take mute off and give people your top tip.
Hi, I just apologise now because my hay fever is really bad, so I'm either going to be sniffing or sneezing probably throughout this. That's why you probably see me looking a bit odd at times. My top tip, like Chris, we had a whole slide filled with top tips, so we've obviously had to choose one each, and mine was the importance of self-care and having effective coping strategies in place. I mean, we are always so busy in social work, and we do a lot outside of work as well, and I'm a very, very busy person. I don't like to sit and kind of do nothing, so I push myself to kind of be on the go all the time, take on more things. I'm a yes person, so my manager will say, I've got another family for you, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I'll have that, and I'll do this, and I'll go and do that, and before you know it, you're kind of fully immersed in, and not being, you know, drowning kind of thing, trying to keep your head above the water. And I think from working from home, it's been really difficult because I've spoke before about kind of blurred lines and not having those boundaries in place, and it coming so much more into your home life, you know, not wanting to kind of take lunch breaks because you don't want to be away from the computer in case people call you and they think you're, you know, sitting in front of the telly and not kind of working. So you're cutting out lunch breaks, you're working longer hours, you're having your work in your kitchen, in your bedroom, in any kind of space in your house, and not being able to kind of close the door on it and have those defined boundaries. And so I would work longer hours. I was kind of accumulating loads of flexi. I was working at weekends at times. I was keeping my work phone on and not switching it off because it would be on my kitchen table. So I would walk past and, oh, I'll just check my emails. I'll just see if anyone needs me. And everyone would be saying, look, come on, you need to start looking after yourself. You need to be doing this, that, and the other. And I had days off here and there, a couple of days maybe, but because we didn't go anywhere, I was still here at home. And so you kind of, okay, I'll just have a look just to make sure everything's okay and nothing's cropped up. And it wasn't until I had a week off a couple of weeks ago where I completely switched off from it. We went away and I just realized how much work has been taking over. And I think that COVID has impacted on that significantly for lots of us. And it is really difficult to have those boundaries in place. But if you don't, we are going to make ourselves ill. And if we are unable to look after ourselves, how can we be in the position to be having those, you know, having those decision skills, having those thoughts and those decision making skills to make the right decisions for families that we're supporting, when we're not in the right headspace, or we're not able to kind of take a step back and really analyze the situations because we're so tired. And I know already a couple of colleagues in my local authority are really struggling in their ASYE because of the same situations, high caseloads because of COVID and the impact of that, and doing more complex work than necessarily we would have beforehand as ASYEs, and not having necessarily the right support put in place. I mean, I'm lucky that I have great manager, mentor, and lots of supportive guys like this team and my team at work who are constantly on my case to ensure that I am switching off. And for me, that's kind of key, to have those people around me to make sure that I am managing my home and work life balance. And it's about finding the right coping strategies for you, really. As I think we've said before, it's not all about smelly candles and spas. It's about the little things. It's about going for a walk. It's about having a break, having a cup of tea, going for a chat with a colleague, going and playing in the park with your children, watching some rubbish on telly, just to kind of get that time out that you need. It is really, really important.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kat. Thank you. You're right. It is really, really important. I wrote down, as you were saying, maybe our top tip should have been learn to say no, because, you starting off saying yes, yes, yes. That is probably maybe one of the things we have to do in the early part of our career is learn to say no. But we are going to do a webinar on that in our next season, is how to say no effectively and professionally. So, because that is really important. And of course, Kat, that link to you wanting to talk about self-care, but also thinking about the first time that you spoke in one of our webinars was about theory in the pandemic, one of our very first webinars, when you talked about moral injury and the impact it had had on you. And it's really stuck with me. And we've talked about moral injury several times in the webinars. But I suppose that's another, for me, top tip, is to be aware of moral injury. We have done a full webinar on this, so I'm sure that everybody that's here knows about it. But I'm still talking about this every week to people who've never heard of it. And essentially, if you've not been at our previous webinars on moral injury, you need to watch it. But it's referring to the psychological distress that results either from being asked to do something that violates your ethics. In social work, we would talk ethics rather than morals, or not being able to do something and that violating your ethics. So it comes, how we understand it now, from the military, which is why we looked at it with veterans in our webinar. But essentially, it's really now being talked about a lot more in the NHS and in education, I've noticed more recently, and also now in social care, around the experiences that we have during COVID and some of the things that you were just talking about, Kat, like walking past and, you know, we bring in work into our own homes and all of those things. It is, as we've said before, very similar to other things that we're familiar with in social work, like vicarious trauma, compassion, fatigue. But you wouldn't expect people to experience those things until they've been qualified a long time. But what I know from my experience, and I am hearing almost a daily basis, newly qualified social workers are experiencing moral injury at a really alarming rate. My fear is if you get moral injury and you're not saying no and you're in a dip, it's going to be too much and it's going to be overwhelming. All of these things can come into play at the same time. Talk to each other about it. Be aware of moral injury. The more that I talk about it, I've been bringing it in because of COVID. You know, the first webinar when we did it was all about COVID, the impact, and here's, you know, one of the things that's going to come out of this for us. I mean, we did that literally, I think it was session number 3. We're on 51 now. So we've been talking about this all this time. But I'm now realizing I experienced moral injury as a newly qualified worker in the first year of my practice. And it was because I was asked to do something. I was asked to describe a young person that I was working with in a way which I refused to do. It was before we had language around child sexual exploitation. And I felt this isn't right. I actually left that team because of what I was being asked to do in that team. And I was very newly qualified at that point. So I recognize that now as a moral injury. Now, that was 30 years before COVID. It's not, moral injury isn't just about COVID practice. It's about being asked to do things that don't sit comfortably with you. And you need to talk to others about that. Now, I've shared this with you before, you know this, but these are the 6 things that mitigate the impact of moral injury, taken from research. Now, this is actually a slide from our moral injury webinar. But what I realised on reflection, using Chris's top tip of reflecting, I was reflecting about this and I thought, do you know, when I pulled all of our tips together, those 6 things closely align with our top tips tonight. Now, that's because, you know, these are basically things that are good for us as practitioners and professionals. Team working, a sense that you belong to a community of practice, a strong reflective culture, good quality emotionally supportive supervision, doing an in-depth reflection focused on your feelings and your emotions. Those things really matter in your first year, in the early part of your career. You might feel at times, you know, Kat talked about people feeling like they've just got massive caseloads. It might feel like, oh my goodness, this is such a busy journey. It becomes almost faceless because it becomes so busy. But actually, very often in the early part of your career, your journey can feel very isolated and very lonely. And I think with the pandemic, it can feel even more so because a lot of the time you're at home on your own. You're not there with your team. So what you need to do is build on your community of support. Think about the team around you and how to connect with those team members. I've showed this before in one of the webinars, but it's another one of my favorite pieces, flip chart developed by a group of newly qualified social workers. And this looks at how it feels to be part of a social work team. And we have shared this before, and you know, there's also a separate video about it on my YouTube channel. But so I'm not going to go into it in lots of detail, but just to say that teams are teams. There are dynamics within teams all of the time. There's lots of different characters in any social work team. And this is what the newly qualified workers I was working with put together, you know, and they said, look, there's a few dinosaurs in every social work team. You know, there's some sharks, there's some chickens that are headless and don't know what's, you know, they're splattering all their mess around them. There's some ostriches with their heads buried in the sand. There's some hedgehogs that are very prickly. You know, there's some owls. Every team has got these different characters. But they described themselves through their first year in practice as starting off as a caterpillar, but through that first year in practice, through that early stage of your career, learning through transformation, to become a butterfly. And it's a beautiful way of thinking about the early part of your career. But as you look around all of that, think about what character are you? What character's your friends? What character are... And let's be honest, we play different roles on different days. And some of this is about how you're feeling at the time. And some of it's a bit about, I think I'm a dinosaur some of the time. Some of the time I'm a bit of a monkey. You know, there's different characters in me on different days. And I think that's the same for all of us. But do think about connecting with your team and how you build on those connections. And so then we're going to go to our most newly qualified worker, Becky, who is only 4 weeks into her first role. So Becky, are you going to put your mic on and just tell us your top tip?
Yep. You wanna... Yeah, so I've put about sharing your calendar. So I've I've remained with the same local authority that I was with on my placement. And even though it's exactly the same area of practice in child protection, I'm in a different team. So I hadn't met anybody, didn't really know anybody. So one of the tips that I was actually given was the one that I'm passing on now, which is about sharing your calendar. So if you go into your settings, you know, in your emails and go into your diary, you can share your calendar with the rest of your team. So that's what I was able to do. So people could see what I was doing during the day, but equally I could see what they were doing. And the team that I've been in, the team that I'm in, they've been really, really good so far. And they're like, oh, you've got a gap there. Do you want to come and do this with me? And it's almost like we're in the office together and they're just kind of saying to me, right, I'm just going to go and do this. Do you want to hop along? You know, do you want to watch this? And it's like shadowing opportunities. And some of them, you know, I'm getting physically, you know, so I can be like, yeah, actually, I can actually come with you. Other times it is sitting in Teams meetings or a conference call or something like that, but they can see my calendar and I can see theirs and I can equally go to them. So I thought that was a pretty good, you know, tip. And in my first 4 weeks, you know, I've got to do things that I didn't get to do once in my entire placement, you know, and that wasn't anybody's fault. It's just kind of different opportunities. And the other thing, I mean, I've put a few things there on the slide, but it's really getting to know the services that your team uses, you know, or whatever kind of setting that you're in. So, you know, if you're going to be making referrals, you kind of, if you're able to go and see where you're referring these people to. So I work with children and we've got a family centre. So I've been to the family centre, so I know where it is, but I know what it looks like inside. And I've met the manager of that, and she actually did like a little induction with me, and she showed me how I can make those referrals when the children need to have their family time. So I think as things are opening up, if you can just book in, even though, you know, there still might be some restrictions around that, if you can book in and physically see these places so they kind of make sense to you, and then it's just not a mindless referral, or you know, you're sending a child or a family or an adult or whatever somewhere, you go there. And then I won't go obviously through them all because time is ticking on, but I've really got to know one of the admin workers on my team, and what I didn't know, she knew. And that's a really good, you know, if you've got a special admin within your team, just go to them and just keep asking the questions, because she's told me things I didn't even know, you know, where there's a cupboard actually in the office, you know, that I can go into, where there's little calling cards, you know, so if I call on a family and they're not in, we've got a card for that, which I didn't know, and stuff. So she's been able to tell me all these little bits of things, you know, so use your HR department, use your specific admin for your team as well, because they're there to kind of help you out as well. And then I spoke, because Siobhan, you mentioned it, and my team's been really, really good. My team manager's been amazing so far. And what he's doing with me at the moment, even though I'm only like 4 weeks in, I've had one supervision, but he's alternating check-ins. So he did a check-in with me in my first week, and then the second week I had a supervision. Last week we had like another check-in. Tomorrow I've got a supervision, and the check-ins aren't formal, and they are just literally, how are you? And last week he was even like, is everybody still being nice to you? You know, like you said in your first check-in, people were being nice. Are they still being nice? You know, and it's lighthearted, and it's not. And it is that, you know, opportunity for me to go, I still don't know what I'm doing. And it's just very off the record, very relaxed, but actually he's touching base with me. So if you're able to get those with your manager, I'd recommend them. So that's it really.
Thank you. Thanks for that advice, Becky. I think it's just brilliant the way you've put it, you know, be visible even if you're not in the same office. I really like that, because I do worry that newly qualified workers can feel quite invisible at the moment because of COVID, because you're just sitting at home perhaps and not in the team in the same way. And it's how do you get connected with the zoo if you're not in the zoo? You know, it's that bit, isn't it? So I really like the way you've put that, Becky. And I also think that's really good advice for students, actually. I mean, you'd have to change the manager to practice educator, but that, for those people who are here who are not yet qualified, it's great advice for students too. So thank you for that. Thanks, Becky. Okay, so we continue the journey and recognise that some people will bring more with them than other people. Some people travel light, some people bring a whole range of stuff with them. And I want you to think about, what's your packing like? Are you that kind of person? I can't pack like that. I imagine there's some, if I was to think about myself now and who packs on the team, like, I'm like that. And I imagine there's some team members that are like that, but I do think there's some team members that pack like that. Maybe we can I'll tell you later who I think packs like which, but I've got an idea of who packs like that. So different team members, I think, are going to pack in different ways. The same way as social workers, we're going to pack and prepare and do things differently. But top tip for you in the early part of your career is to use Share. It will help you to organise your packing, helps you to make sure you've not forgotten anything. We did a full webinar on Share. You know, you might want to rewatch that. But Share is basically a model that you can use to analyse situations. And I've tried to put a grid here around your Share as a newly qualified worker. So at the top row, look, what opportunities do you get to see things? A bit like Becky was just saying, really, going out to visit places is really helpful. What opportunity do you get to observe other workers? As Becky was saying, you used to be sat in an office and you'd say, well, can I come with you on that? Now you've got to seek that opportunity out, but it is still there. How are you going to do that? Think about what you're hearing and who you're hearing it from. Honestly, you will hear things like, oh, I don't know why you want to be a social worker. I wouldn't want to do it if I had my time over again. You're going to hear some really negative stuff from cynical workers, as well as some really positive, helpful stuff. But think about who you're listening to and who you're taking advice from. Think about what you're doing, what action you're taking. Think about, what are you reading? You know, like Nicholas said, you read policy after policy after policy and you're like, I can't remember what you've read. How do you connect that with your practice? That's when it's going to be most useful to read it. And how do you evaluate your experience in the early part of your career? How are you pulling that together? Maybe use that top tip I gave you of surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning to evaluate how things are going. The bottom line, that's about if you're being assessed or your team manager or other team members, what's their share in your early part of your career? So what do other people see of you? You know, think about Becky's tip to make yourself visible. Can they see you? Are you visible to them? Think about what your assessor sees of your practice. They might have to do some direct observations of you. How are you going to do that? How are you going to set that up? What do other people hear from you or even about you? Think about how you're gathering feedback. Think about what you're letting people know. Think about how you're speaking to the people that you're with. Think about whether you're asking them about advice or have you had a dip or this is how things are going for me. Reach out, speak to people. What action are other people taking to support you? And is it what you would expect? Is there something more that you want people to do? And how are you going to communicate that to them? Your manager and your assessor, if you have one, are going to read your recording. It says there, students, ignore that. I should say it will read your recording, your reflection. And then how is your practice being evaluated? So that's share. Think about your own share. Think about your team, your mentor, if you have one, your assessor, team manager, other people who surround you during the early part of your career. What's their share? You're going to have to find your direction, though. You know, it's a difficult journey. It's a complex landscape that you're traveling, as I said, and you've got to find your direction, because at times this is how you're going to feel. You're going to feel lost, confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disorientated, bewildered. You're going to feel all of those things, and that's okay. It's then about, how do you find your way through that? How do you find your direction? And I know I talk about it all the time. But if I was meeting with you, say I used to meet with groups of newly qualified workers every fortnight in their first year of practice. And I probably said this to them every fortnight in their first year of practice. So I've only said it a few times to you as a group. I'm going to say it again. What, why, how? It is so important to use this in every single thing that you do. If I asked you to sit and think about the people that you're working with, the families you support or the adults that you support, go through each of those people that you're working with as a social worker. Could you tell me what you're doing with that person, that family, what you're going to do in your next few visits to them? Why are you doing it? And how you're going to do it? And how you expect it to impact? Because that is all about the purpose of social work. As a social worker, you need to go and see a family or talk with a family or an adult, or however you're doing it. You might be doing it virtually at the moment. You need to be able to answer what's going on for this person. Why is it happening? How can I work with them to bring about improved outcomes? All of the time, this is what we've got to do. What, why, how? The danger is that quite often in that first year of your practice, when you're going from being a student where you ask a lot of why questions, you know, I love working with students because they say to me, why do you do it like that, Siobhan? It makes me think. But what can happen when you make that transition from the student into a social worker is the why question falls off your agenda, and it becomes much more like, what forms do I have to fill in? How do I do this? What do I need to do next? How do I get this done? How do I do a referral? What do I do now? What and how? And you lose your why. And there's a real major danger in losing the why. Well, firstly, it's a loss of professional curiosity, isn't it? But it's also, it loses the central purpose. The why question is the most important question we can ever ask. It's where we hypothesize. It's where we create connectivity that Nicola's talked about in her tip. When we lose the why, our practice becomes process driven. Our practice becomes like a medical model way of working. We have to have why in our practice, and you need it to avoid slipping into that cynical spiral. Those social workers who say to you, oh, I don't know why you want to be a social worker, I wouldn't do it if I had my time over again. They've been pulled, sucked into this cynical spiral of practice. But I've been qualified 31 years. I'm not newly qualified, but what I do, what I think social work is and why I do it has stayed the same. 35 years since I started my journey as a student social worker, and in those 35 years, what social work is and why I do it hasn't changed. How I do it, where I do it, who employs me to do it, all that stuff, that's changed loads of times. But if you keep hold of your what and your why, it keeps things central and it stops you getting sucked into that downwards vortex of the cynical spiral. So if you think about the journey, the team you're on, the environment you're in, you know, lots of people say, oh, social work, it's not for me, it's not for me. What do you mean that team's not for you, or that particular area of social work? Social work is so vast, it's so wide, it's as big as the world, it's wonderful as a profession. How do you view it? Where you are now, where you are for the early part of your career, let's imagine it's like a holiday home on your journey. What kind of holiday home does social work feel like to you? Does it feel like that? I've never been there. It's just a picture off Google Images. I think it's like the Maldives or something, you know, the ideal. I just put in ideal holiday home. That's what came up. Is that how social work feels to you? Or does your holiday home of social work feel a bit more like that? Because if it's feeling like that, you're not in the right place. Doesn't mean social work's not right for you. Social work is huge. You need to keep focused on your why. Remember when you were a student, when you started your training, they asked you, why do you want to be a social worker? Probably every practice educator you've had on a placement has said to you, why do you want to be a social worker? The thing is, you're qualified now. There's no, why do you want to be a social worker? You are a social worker. But what you've got to think about now is, I am a social worker because I hear so many social workers, and especially since COVID, it's been exaggerated since COVID. I hear so many social workers saying, this isn't why I became a social worker. And when you say, okay, well, why did you become a social worker? You'll get something like, well, I wanted to work with people. And I kind of get what they're saying, you know, because it's when they're sitting at a computer and everything's just crashed, they normally say that. But, you know, to say I want to work with people, that's not enough. Taxi drivers work with people, hairdressers work with people, everybody, you know, all people professions work with people. Why social work? I am a social worker because. How are you going to finish that sentence? Because that sentence is your core, and that is going to go through your whole qualified career with you. No need to think about, I want to be a social worker, because you are a social worker. You are qualified now. I am a social worker because if you keep focused on why you're not a social worker, then you'll end up finding that every day in your practice, and then you'll get sucked into that negative, cynical spiral. If you focus on why you are a social worker, you will find that every day in your practice, and it will prevent that cynical spiral. So, the start of the webinar, we said we were going to offer you 12 top tips for your first 12 months. And these are our top tips shared with the team and filled in by me. Know your starting point and communicate it honestly and effectively to other people. Recognize you're going to have a dip. Talk to others about your dip. Keep reflecting and keep making connections. Ensure that you truly know the focus of your team and get familiar with the policies and the procedures. Prepare effectively for supervision and make the most of all the supervision opportunities that you get. Maintain your work-life balance and practice self-care. I'm going to add to that and learn to say no. Be aware of moral injury for yourself and for other people, your colleagues you work with. Build on your community of support. Make yourself visible, even if you're not in the same physical space. Look for a mentor or a coach as well. They can help you grow. You know, I think Di will probably, I think Di was telling me about mentoring schemes and how mentors can really help. But there's lots of mentor schemes available. I think if you're a member of your professional association in your country, very often you can get mentors for new workers from those schemes. So look out for that. That's really helpful in terms of helping you to grow. Use share. It helps, you know, get share in place and think about your share and the share of the others around you. And use the what, why, how framework. It's going to take you through your whole career. Remember your why and avoid the cynical spiral. That's our top 12 top tips for your first 12 months in practice. But then, just before we go tonight, I want to just talk a little bit in more detail about how many of the things that the 4 team members who are qualified have shared with you tonight, and many of the tips that we've talked about as well. If you were at the graduation last week, you'll see Omar, who was one of our founder members of Social Work Connect, who's moved on now to be the co-director of the International Federation of Social Workers Young Social Workers Project. Now, that's not about age. They're calling it Young Social Workers because they're newly qualified social workers, but it's a word that works across other languages. So that's why it says young. So we could say in English, we might say more new social workers. Now that project has had almost 1,000 responses from newly qualified social workers and hundreds of conversations all the way across Europe, and lots of themes have come out of those conversations with newly qualified workers. Themes around the need for training and education to prepare you well for qualified practice, placements and internships, supports in job searching, particularly internationally, that's a big issue. Support in employment, both personal and organisational support. Support from Federation, the International Federation, but also from your professional associations in your country, and international and national guidance on taking that transitional step. And the policy paper, we are finishing it up at the moment, and that's due out later this year with guidance for new social workers, guidance for employers. So look out for that, because actually that will be helpful to you. It's an international document. It should be an easy read because it's written for people whose first language isn't English, but you might be able to pull that in if you do have a portfolio to complete, for example. So I wanted to just highlight that, and we'll probably talk about it in a webinar when it comes out as well anyway. So that was our 51st webinar. We decided to go up to 52 because there's 52 weeks in a year, so it's kind of like, okay, we've done a full 52. There's 52 cards in a pack, so we've played the whole pack. There's a joker still to throw in maybe, but we've played the whole pack. So next week is our 52nd webinar, and we're going to do a back to basics. We're going to look at the A to Z of social work theory. We're going to take you through a whole A to Z of social work theory with team members sharing their thoughts and lots of ideas and advice on how we can use theory in our practice. And it will be suitable for everybody, students and qualified workers, and people who've been around social work for many years. So the team will be, I am sure, putting the link for that into the chat at the moment so that you can register straight away for that. And after that, we're going to take a short break, and then we're returning on Wednesday, the 15th of September, with some fabulous sessions coming up for next season. And definitely one of those is learning to say no professionally, which will be important, I think, after I've listened to a few of the team members tonight. So thank you ever so much to everybody. I don't know if there's anything in the chat that team members wanted to say or ask, or because I can't see the chat. But is everything okay? People are shaking their heads. It looks like everything's okay for us to conclude the session. Thank you ever so much, and see you all next week. Bye. Good night.